All right. Hey there. So thanks so much, Benjamin. This is really cool to speak to you. And literally a couple of days out of being featured on front cover of Make magazine. And I should say that this is really interesting that you've taken essentially a series of sensors and made a digital nose. But the thing that really intrigued me was the fact that the sensor array that you used, not to be down on your product, but it is quite a cheap one. It's quite unsophisticated, yet you've used machine learning to almost fill the gap between the cheapness and what would be a ridiculously expensive laboratory grade sensor. So I wondered, could you just sort of talk me through a little bit how the project came to be and your process?
Yeah. So yeah, for the lack of a better word, it's an artificial nose, but it's probably not as advanced as an actual nose. But yeah, it started about a year ago when, like early in the pandemic, I wanted to perfect my bread recipe. And I knew, because like they've been around for many years, I knew there were some sensors available for sensing gas, right? And so like my intuition was that I could probably build a device that would pick up the amount of alcohol, of carbon monoxide, and things like that in my sourdough starter, and use this sort of fingerprint to and correlate this fingerprint with the quality of the bread that eventually the sourdough would give me, right? And I was hoping that I could train a model where I would like bake, and that's what I realized eventually, that I would bake dozens and dozens of baguettes and build a data set where there would always be like the correlation between between the sourdough starter that were used for baking a particular baguette, and that particular baguette would be a 9 out of 10 in terms of crispiness and whatnot, and then building that model. I ended up realizing that maybe building such a data set would take me too much time and too much flour, which wasn't even available on the shelves back in May last year. Um, so yeah, I realized I could train a model that would correlate the amount of gases that the sensors would detect with a particular smell. And I did some training with booze, and so rum, whiskey, and whatnot. And turns out that the sensor array, like the super cheap one, that gives you a sense of how much alcohol, how much volatile organic compounds, etc., you have in the air. If you take that as an input, if you do just a bit of AI, almost like 101, you clean up the signal to extract what's actually corresponding to what was my intuition back then, extracting things like what is the, like, over a short period of 5 seconds, what is the minimum, the maximum amount of alcohol that the nose picked up? Like, how much did it fluctuate? What is the average? And once you capture that information, even if the sensor is not that accurate, turns out that's actually enough to feed into a very simple neural network that then establishes and can be trained on figuring out what is the correlation between the minimum, the maximum, etc., of all the gases that the sensor array can pick up with categories of smells: whiskey number one, whiskey number two, and rum number one and rum number two. Like that I tried, and it works, and that's just like, wow.
And I think what's also interesting and worth remembering is that, you know, sometimes as humans we have an ability to simplify things, and obviously that's good when it works, but we also have an ability to sort of overcomplicate things. And you cited just in the chat that we had before this, just the realization around ammonia being related to burning food,
Mhm.
and how that could have saved you a bit of time. Would you mind just sort of recapping a little bit that, because I think it's such an interesting example of how sometimes the computer can say, well, actually, this is really the thing that you're looking for, but you didn't know it.
Yeah, yeah. So my original experiment was like literally using just one sensor. It turns out to be four in one. It's a sensor that can kind of pick up CO2, nitrogen dioxide, volatile organic compounds, and ethyl alcohol, but it kind of picks up a bit of everything. And so if you do enough training, I realized that it can actually be fairly accurate, even at detecting burning food. But doing some research, I also realized that maybe from day one, if I really care about is if what I really care about is burning food, then adding like a dedicated ammonia sensor in the first place would probably be better because that's what chemistry and state of the art tells us. But it's funny that even without an ammonia sensor, you can still like the neural network, almost just like our brain, can still make up for that missing information. On paper, ammonia is not something that any of my sensors pick up, and yet you can the model can learn from that. If you add the actual ammonia sensor, that's even better, of course. Just like, yeah, again, just like our brain, someone who's lost the sense of vision, they still see,
Yeah.
right? They because and
I mean, do you think in some ways, like the analogy? I know this is like a sort of classic test that if you take a word like make and then you cover it up,
wrong
like
issue. It's the wrong issue.
I know. Sorry, it
Wrong
hasn't
issue.
arrived yet in the UK.
Wrong. That's the
Wrong.
one.
Okay, that's the one. Go out, available in all good shops in America, and a month later in the UK. Yeah, but you know, it's that thing, isn't it? Like you can still read that word make, and our brain has like, and I feel like what you've almost done is you've done the sense equivalent of said, I've trained you to recognize the word, but the cheap sensor can get by with that because the machine
Yeah,
learning guesses the rest.
yeah, and it's really yeah, exactly. And like I shared with you before we started to record, and like I shared on a number of occasions over the past year, last year, like I literally had no clue about what a neural network was. Like even the simplest like 101 example with like neurons and layers, I was like, I don't get it. But now, having worked on a very tangible project with like smells and things like that, I can actually feel like I literally feel like I guess that's the way my brain works. Feel why we're talking about the neural network in the first place. Oh, this is what it means to figure out how much such characteristic might contribute to this result, right? And just like you, as you were showing the cover, like I was like, oh yeah, the model would essentially learn that there is red in there and being like, okay, there is 10% of the reddishness that will contribute to it being a make magazine cover, but it also requires a few more inputs, and that's what you're yeah, that's what you're designing when you're building your neural network, and that's what you need to have in mind when training your model. But again, like for me, it was just super obscure a year ago, and I hope that through the project, I've helped at least a few folks realize that there are ways to get started, and for folks whose brain is wired like mine, maybe starting with like Arduino kind of devices and TinyML that might help.
So yeah, maybe to recap and just underscore that point, you are not a machine learning, deep learning, AI specialist. You are
No,
someone who's just bootstrapped your way into this, and you know, and I guess it's worth pointing out that that has pros and cons. I mean, of course, it means that you know you would hit this ceiling of like, okay, I now need to go speak to an expert because I
yeah,
want to do something very advanced, but
yes,
sometimes the issue of that experts miss the low hanging fruit. Do you feel?
yeah, yeah. And I mean, on the topic of doing something more advanced, yes, like what feel already and where I have no idea where I would even start is a V2 of the nose could be something where you have not one but two, three, 10 sensors at different places around the source of the smell, and so that you could capture almost like the trail of the smell, right? And you for that, because again, that's how our brain works, right? And a strong smell might just disappear in the air faster than a slightly lighter smell. And for that, like, I'm sure there is a neural network that could capture that information that would probably be like super accurate in many ways. But is that really useful to like go that deep when essentially, and that's also a realization I made when working on the project, when essentially, if my use case is really just telling apart a good smell from a nasty smell, then at the end of the day, I might not need, I might not even need a neural network in the first place. It's just I might want to tinker with a sort of an AI pipeline or tool suite for tinkering with the data, training some AI algorithms, etc., only to realize maybe at the end of the day that, hey, you know what? I just rather like graph the amount of ammonia, and it turns out it might be ammonia and only ammonia that for my particular use case will be enough to tell, hey, it smells bad. Maybe AI will take me a bit further, maybe not, and maybe crappy low-cost sensors and super simple neural networks, almost to the point where there is no neural network at all.
Mm.
Sometimes it's enough, right? Yeah.
I think this is so interesting. I mean, I guess it's what engineers would call the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule of like, 80% of the accuracy is done with, 20% of the basics, I guess is what we're saying here. I mean, I kind of find it interesting having, worked as a kid in kitchens. And it's interesting when you watch chefs, you could say, well, is it all about smell? But I guarantee you, chefs can tell whether something is, on too high a heat or whether it's nearly finished by the sound. Never mind the look. They can hear from the oil and the interaction with a steak or a particular vegetable. They can tell what stage of it is. I absolutely can see that, and have been shown that by chefs.
Mm-mm.
And so I feel that in some ways, it's interesting that we sometimes think of sensors in quite a siloed way. And I love the fact that you've got this array of 4 different sensors. And even though it's all to do with gas, you mentioned, not to steal your thunder, and it's definitely your idea, but let's say your nose also had a pair of eyes. It might
Mm-hmm.
be looking at the baguette and going, you know what? I can tell that's not right. Or, we were
Or
discussing maybe a microphone will say, hey, it's not very crispy when you squeeze
or
it.
you know what? Not even like it could be even. I think I didn't try, but I'm pretty sure it could be useful, even if you don't have an actual sensor. Back to the sourdough use case, one thing that, like, again, chefs and professional bakers would tell is that the like the ambient humidity will have an implication. And even if you don't have a humidity sensor, why not feed your AI model with the weather forecast?
Yep.
Right? That might or might not allow to pick up some elements, some factors that may or may not contribute to a particular output and conclusion, right? And if the air is definitely too dry, no matter how alcoholy the sourdough starter is, just don't bake your bread. It's, I don't know, like things like that.
That would be a really interesting thing to almost feed back to these bread specialists, and
Yeah.
almost be like, this is a bad bread day. You do not want to bake
Yeah.
this. It's not going to rise the way you think it is. And as you said, you mentioned humidity, but of course it might be, I mean, I'm guessing here, I don't know whether barometric pressure would affect it, but
Mm-hmm.
let's say that it wasn't to do with bread, but it was something else, perhaps wine tasting. Perhaps that actually does change something in the experience. And so I think what I love about the interaction with, I'm deliberately saying cheap sensors, but enhanced and compensated for by machine learning, is it's almost sort of out of the realms of what humans automatically ascribe as being a relevant data point. I think
Mm-hmm.
this is the sort of dawn of like, humans can definitely close the loop and say, I don't care what the machine said, that bread tasted horrible, in which case you need to go in and change the model, right? But there might be days where you say, hey, I'd never even thought about that the kitchen has 50 people in it today, and that's completely changed the way the bread has risen. Whereas
Yeah.
actually, when we bake on a Sunday, there's only 2 people in there, and it's the best bread. You won't see that unless the model actually extracts those data points. So
Yep.
I think sometimes the serendipity, I think that's going to be the signature of a lot of different machine learning breakthroughs, is stuff that humans just didn't think about.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. Agreed.
but yeah, so I guess maybe as sort of like an endpoint, what next? What are you hoping to do next?
That's a great question. So, like everything is on, because that's the way I roll. I guess everything is open source and open hardware. Hopefully, you can include a link somewhere in the video description. I would love for folks to contribute back some improvements that they may be making to the project. Like especially, it has a nice looking, or there's like a funny, let's say, enclosure, but it's not doing the best job at just sucking the air into the device. So anyone out there with like a fluid dynamics engineer, feel free to improve the 3D model, and we can put a new version on Thingiverse. But beyond that, I think what would be interesting would be to look like as a community, as an AI DIY like enthusiasts kind of community, just like there is a ton now of data sets for training models for doing computer vision. Like, there's tons of data sets of labeled images, and here's your dog, here's your cat, and we even have the same for video now. I don't think we have the same for smells. Building sort of an open data set of smells and fingerprints of smells, so that folks could use that to train their models faster and to do sort of like transfer learning, to not have to start from scratch over and over again. Like you want to build a model to bake the perfect brioche, then maybe it could be helpful to have already the fingerprint of sourdough, the fingerprint of bread, the fingerprint of whatever. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure where to start for that, especially since we're back to the problem of, if the sensors are not super reliable, not super calibrated, maybe this is where like low-tech sensors can become a problem. But yeah, that's something that I would like to experiment.
That sounds great. And look, thank you so much for your time,
Thank
Ben.
you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. And we'll obviously put a link in the description below. But yeah, congratulations on front cover of Make as well. It's terrific.
Yeah, that was cool. Thank you.
Take care.